Welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Ernest Liu. I will be the moderator. Today's webinar is sponsored by the Julius Rabinow Center for Public Policy and Finance and the Benheim Center for Finance at Princeton. Today, we're very honored to have Chris Wheat, who is the Director of Business Research for the JPMorgan Chase Institute. Chris leads a team that transforms large, high granularity de-identified data into flexible data assets that reflect retail and services transactions in neighborhoods and cities and small business financial behavior and outcomes. Some of his recent work has delved into the impact of COVID-19 on local commerce and the role of cash in small business transactions, as well as the use of big data to understand racial disparities in financial outcomes. Prior to joining JPMorgan Chase Institute, Chris served as the Director of Analytics at a financial technology startup, where he led the development of advanced analytics algorithms. Previously, Chris was on the faculty at MIT's Sloan School of Management and at the Center of Urban Entrepreneurship and Economic Development at Rutgers Business School. Chris has taught and researched topics in strategy, entrepreneurship, global microfinance, economic sociology, and social network analysis. And Chris earned a bachelor's in mechanical and aerospace engineering from Princeton, a master's in computer science from Stanford, and a master's in sociology from Harvard, and finally a Ph.D. in organizational behavior from Harvard University. So today the webinar will last for about 60 minutes, and Chris will present for the first 30 minutes, and we will go into Q&A. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. It is, I want to say it's like interesting to be back, although being back means something different, I guess, in 2020 than it might in some other year. I'll note that this is would have been my 25th anniversary year, and so I will see you guys next year is apparently the plan. So let me do a screen share and go ahead and dive in. Assuming that's coming through. So look, the title of this talk is Big Data Insights on the COVID-19 economy. And what I thought I would do is walk you both through the content of the research that we've been engaged in the last 7 months or so, and also a little bit of the process with the view to teeing up questions about sort of like how we're thinking about the relationship between data that we can collect from a private sector entity, JPMorgan Chase, and use to try to engage with policy questions about the economy and sort of to see the interplay between the two of those as a way of thinking through at least the questions that are front of mind for me as we start to look toward ongoing legislative questions, a new administration, and a lot of thoughts about sort of like, well, what is the appropriate way for policymakers to respond to what is an ongoing economic situation and public health situation, probably first and foremost. By way of giving a little bit of an introduction to the Institute, and I won't spend too much time here, but I think it's helpful to give some context to what I'm going to go through. So like, who are we and what do we do? The shortest version of that is like, you could think about us as sort of part think tank, part data science shop. And what we generally are doing is taking the administrative data from across the JPMorgan Chase platform. What you'll see today is really the retail platform. So think consumer and small business deposit accounts, credit cards, things like that. We get the data, it's de-identified, but we still know things about the demographic characteristics of our consumers, or firmographic, to the extent they're looking at firms versus individuals. And we try to use that data to answer policy questions and questions about the economy across a variety of healthcare themes, a variety of research themes, of which you see 7 here. And if you were to go to our website, you'd see now an 8th, which has really just been kind of this integrated lens on what's happening in the economy with respect to COVID. What I'm going to talk about today will draw both from the small business, a little bit at the back, time allowing on the cities and local communities piece of that, but also quite a bit from the labor markets and household income spending themes that we've addressed as an institute. That's not the research that's largely coming out of my team, but I think one of the promises of our organization is the ability to look across a couple of different lenses, and while not providing a fully complete view, at least a bit more of an integrated view about what's going on in the economy. So bear with me as I present other people's research in addition to that of my own team, and looking forward to questions that are across that spectrum. So if we were going to go back to probably early March, because I was trying to think through this morning in terms of when this was actually happening. We were getting inbound questions from our colleagues at the bank, from media, from economic reporters, from other think tanks, and from other entities, largely in sort of federal and local governments. We're trying to think through like, well, we see COVID starting to be a problem in the US, and what do you guys know about what's going to happen? And usually when I've talked about our research, I've started a couple of slides into this presentation, sort of just diving into sort of our results. But as I was thinking about, the way we've experienced it and sort of where we are today even, a lot of that is like a process of continually looking at sort of prior research to try to understand what it's telling us about the economy, because things keep changing in a way where I don't want to say that it's unprecedented, but a lot of the way we've thought about the world hasn't exactly lined up to what we're seeing in the data. And so that tends to be a theme I think you'll see run through here. And so what I wanted to start with kind of was like, well, what did we know in March, at least based on our own research, and what was in our heads and in our conversation with people who were trying to understand what they should be anticipating as March and April played out, when we didn't know the length of the pandemic, and all we knew was that something very big was coming, and we weren't really sure what was going to happen in the economy. And so, I think I would point to a couple of things that we had seen in our research before that. More on the household side, we had done a bunch of research in general looking at short-term fluctuations in cash flows and household spending, typically, sometimes in household expenses, as they related to one another and how they were mitigated by the liquid assets that houses typically had. And a fairly consistent finding in that space was that there was a lot of sensitivity, a surprising amount of sensitivity to shocks that you might think that households could smooth through. So here, this chart is showing from a prior report. This was something we released late last year, about a year ago, looking at the overarching question here was actually looking at sort of racial difference in household financial outcomes. But the picture here, I think the top line is probably the most important thing, although the second order thing is important too. When we would see job loss in a family, we would see very sharp responses in spending. And yes, they differed by race, but I think the important thing to see, and that we were thinking was going to be important as we looked into what we thought was going to happen, in a universe where it was reasonable to expect that there was going to be a lot of people not working for one reason or another, depending on what the public policy response was around both the economics and the public health. What is that going to mean? And it was pretty clear to us that it was going to mean something substantial in terms of drops in demand, drops in consumption, and how that was going to push the economy, and something that we thought it was going to be important for policymakers to pay attention to, but we didn't know exactly how big it was going to be. The only thing we knew was that in something that's kind of similar, like the household version, individual of this disaster, somebody lost a job versus everybody in the economy loses a job, right? Or a huge swath stops working. And you still see a quite pronounced drop in spending in that family, call it around, somewhere between 8 to 12%, depending on here, the race of the householder. Likewise, we had done a lot of work on the small business side to understand similar questions. An important thing we saw there as context, and this isn't really so much a disaster as is just the context, thinking about the other side of the demand equation here, like the supply side on the small business sector anyway. We thought it was important to tell people that, in that part of the economy, there really isn't a lot of cash liquidity. Here, what you're seeing on the left side of this chart is what we would call cash buffer days, which is like how many days could a business keep operating out of the amount of money it would typically hold in the bank account. We kind of had the same level of operating expenses and other outflows, which we would shorthand as if all inflows and revenues were to stop for a small business, call it 2 to 3 weeks, depending on characteristics of the business. Here you see it cut by race. And again, as context there, the typical small business in the sector is pretty small. I mean, really, really small if you want to think about it in terms of revenues for a Black-owned business, but just across the board, we're still looking at lots of small businesses here, with about $100,000 in revenue, even through the first 5 years. So like when we think about the sector, just like that context, these were the things we were quite worried about. One of the reasons we were, in particular, my team was particularly worried about this, with some caveats, was we had looked at disasters before. I mean, not clear that COVID is exactly the same as a hurricane, but it was the closest thing we had. What you see here is changes in inflows, which you can sort of think about as similar to revenues. Huge drops when you see a hurricane come through in Miami or in Houston, as we did some years ago in 2017. But like a surprising amount of resilience, and we weren't really sure how to think through like what would this mean for a prolonged kind of exposure as we were anticipating with COVID, but certainly a question about would small businesses snap back in exactly the same way in terms of revenues? Like we thought probably not, because the disruption is not sort of a hurricane passing through for a week and leaving whatever damage it leaves, but possibly something quite a bit longer. So we're quite worried about that and sort of shared that out. And then a little bit of a question, and you'll sort of come back to this later, about sort of what would small business owners actually do seeing these kinds of losses. 2 slides ago, I said, if their outflows continued, think a couple of weeks, 3 weeks of ability to run without sort of running out of money. But what we actually saw was that they were resilient, with like quotes around it, like they will pull back expenses at least for a short amount of time, but honestly didn't know what this was going to look like for a longer disruption. So again, I think this is all, it's kind of a bit of context that we were walking into March and April with, as we started to try to understand what could we use these data to do in terms of engaging with policymakers in a conversation about like what might be most helpful to do. I'm going to start on the household side because again, it sort of seems like the right place to start. It's like, at least from my point of view, sitting around usually more sort of like business and local economics, we think about it sort of like the inflows, like the demand is the other side of consumer behavior. And so like one of the reasons I tend to care about a lot. And this, I don't think a chart that looks like this is a surprise to anybody in November 2020, but again, just kind of like playing the movie forward, we did see this like really huge drop in spending. You might recall again from the prior slide that we were seeing drops of 10% or so when sort of an individual family would lose a job. Of course, they were getting unemployment to sort of offset that. But I don't know that anybody at the time was anticipating this large of a drop. Interestingly, at least to us, that early response was like not sensitive to a lot of things we thought it might be sensitive to. Like, yes, we saw somewhat differences, different response for higher income versus lower income families, but it was like a lot smaller than I think we anticipated it being. Across the cities where we had a point of view, we didn't see like either the dip or the timing nearly as moved as we thought it would be. Really like many fewer demographic differences in that early response. It was like everybody just stopped spending, which we think is because everybody was responding to the disease as opposed to some of the policy stuff, like whether or not there's a stay-at-home order or not. Across the, call it 20 odd cities where we have a good view, people were not spending. They were pulling it back. They weren't going into the workplace to the extent that they could manage not to, and we saw these like really big dips. Where I think things started to get a little bit more interesting and sort of playing out both kind of the policy conversation and sort of what's happening in the economy, right? We didn't observe what would have happened if there had been no policy response. What we did observe was what happened, in as much as we and others weighed in saying like, it's really important to find ways to support people who aren't going into work. The CARES Act rolled out. Notably, there was a variety of economic impact payments, including but not limited to the increased payments, the sort of the federal support on $600 on top of the unemployment payments. And, not surprisingly, I suppose, with the benefit of hindsight, that program caused people to spend. Like it was playing out the mechanism that we thought would play out, right? The people who are going to be very responsive, UI recipients, tending to have a smaller cash liquidity in the household are going to respond. We've seen it like in many other contexts. You sort of push liquidity in that household, you're going to see the spending response, and you see it differentially here. So here the orange line is UI recipients who are getting that extra bump in April as compared to people who stay employed throughout the whole period. Both groups you see kind of having that similar response that I suggested, sort of in what here is mapped to those early weeks of sort of March and April, but like a real sharp response amongst the UI recipients. Interestingly, and I think documented well by others at this point too, is that the spending actually goes up above and beyond where it was before, right? You have people with more time, they're actually getting a higher income in some cases than they had prior to separation of the job because of that incremental payment coming in from the federal government, and we're seeing it in the spending response. Actually, sort of spending response going over 100% to 10% up, even more so after 4 weeks, which was kind of an interesting thing to think about in terms of, okay, now that we got a program out, like how do you think about scaling it and targeting it and making sure that it's leveled in the right way? Although even here, it's not totally clear sort of how to think about what you want that program designed to be, which I think is a great thing to sort of talk through and think about questions on. To that point, if you play this out over a longer period of time, right, and this is, again, sort of us thinking through as we are getting more data and we're seeing what happens, right? At some point, that $600 weekly supplement did expire. As I think expected, you do see that decline in the spending here in the blue line of those people who are receiving unemployment benefits. They sort of arc up over the spending of the people who are staying employed throughout the whole period. As we saw in the prior slide, it stays up for a while. It's not just May, it's not just June, it keeps going up and up and up. But then it does start to peak down when that incremental benefit goes away and actually is dropping below the expenditure of the employee, sort of getting back to what it might have looked like in a prior period. So was it too much? Was it not enough? It's a little bit hard to see through this lens. I mean, a thing to think about is, an additional view that we have being the bank. So we don't just see the spending, we also see the balances as suggested in prior slides. Really interesting here to see that amongst that population that were still receiving benefits in July and August, a very, very large increment in liquid savings, right? So, you can interpret this as those households are accumulating the extra payments, they're not spending it all out, right? Like there is a spending response, like some of that is getting pushed into the economy. Is it rational behavior or not? I am not an economist by training, so I'm not going to weigh that too much, but you are seeing, so holding on to it. And it's certainly what you would see if you kind of got a press view of this anyway. You sort of like talk to people. A lot of narratives out there, like we don't know what the ongoing policy response is going to be. We have uncertainty about it. That idea that you might hold on to some of that and not spend it all out is certainly reflected in what we saw in the data. And then again, you can kind of see how that's playing out a little bit in the bottom two graphs here that are showing both the inflows and the outflows. And on the bottom left here, you can see that those checking account outflows were not growing as fast as the inflows, right? Is another way to think about sort of why there's an accumulation in the liquid balances. So, that, at least to me, is a person sitting on the business side of this, is an interesting lens on the demand side, like how to think through that set of policies, like what is it doing in terms of driving the expenditures that are showing up as revenues to all businesses, of which I think small businesses are a particularly interesting policy concern. Now I'm setting the clock back and showing, again, more at the beginning of the pandemic, well, what was happening on the other side. And so this should more or less match, right? I do think an interesting question that we don't yet have as good of a lens on as I hope to sometime soon is like there's another view of all of these charts that I could show you that's larger businesses. My impression, mostly anecdotally from my own behavior, is that there was a lot of movement away from small businesses. So like these charts might not be as sharp for the match set of larger businesses, but sort of we don't really have the data quite yet. But here you do see this very steeply pitched chart of both the blue line, which is small business revenues. And here, this is what I'm calling typical revenues. It's like an estimate of the median revenue that we see in our small business customers, right? So these are bank small businesses, but they are not necessarily lending customers, so they're not in any sort of credit box, and so they're more or less representative of at least relatively small, think less than 5 employee small businesses that comprise most of the small business sector. But yeah, a really, really sharp drop in revenues through March, kind of bumping around through April, but kind of staying at a fairly low level. And in a way that was similar to what we saw, at least in the early days, a very similar response on the expenses where, the typical small business seeing these revenue declines is cutting the expenses, more or less dollar for dollar, right? Like there's some gaps that you can interpret there, but I think that the big picture thing that we saw and kind of like walked away with was at least the first few weeks of this were looking a lot like the way that small businesses had responded to other disasters, to the extent that they thought that they could hold out. They were pulling their expenses back, which one might think about it in terms of its longer term implications. The shape of the balance trajectory was more surprising. And again, this is one of those times that this is the data that we had when we sort of rolled out with the first piece on this. It was through the end of April. Again, there is a policy response that's happening in the middle of this. And so, in April, the first round of PPP starts to roll out. Right at the end of this data series, you start to see a second round of PPP go out. There were other programs in flight, and at the time, we didn't really know how to interpret this, the right side of this chart, like the middle through April 12th was not so hard to interpret. It's like small businesses are doing the best that they can, but they're seeing a pretty big drop in their liquidity, which we know starts at a pretty low level. So dropping, 13% or so off year over year it's quite a big hit. It sort of lines up against other major disasters and sort of thing you might worry about, particularly in the long run. So like we saw that was a pretty big hit, like something we want to be worried about. But then we do see this turning around and coming back up by the end of April. And so we wanted to understand why that was happening. That story, not for nothing, does play out against a lot of dimensions that we thought were important to call out at the time, particularly as we were trying to think about, are we going to come around with more policy response? Like how might you think about targeting that? I think directionally not a surprise that restaurants were particularly hard hit in terms of revenues, but also in terms of balances, a little bit less clear, like what the story was going to be there. Personal services firms also taking a really big hit here. Not shown here are other industries that are on the other side of this dotted line, which is the all line. Things like healthcare service providers, which had their own set of policy responses that we can talk through if people want to talk about that. But we actually saw some balance recovery quite a bit faster in industries not shown here, which was interesting. And I had mentioned before a little bit in passing the notable differences in cash liquidity and size by owner race. In 2020, lots of reasons. In 2019, lots of reasons to be concerned about this, and then again in 2020, I think sort of incremental reasons to be concerned about that. And we did see, particularly early days, Black and Asian owned businesses taking very big hits to revenues and balances as well. And again, sort of a lot of policy hooks in there for those who want to think about what the implications are for different ways that we could roll out programs. we got some more data. We're able to see at least sort of another month of what happened. And in the next two charts, I'm only showing a couple of industries because that's what we focused on in our follow-up piece. But I think we did learn some interesting things about the ways that these policies flow through at least the small business sector. And so this chart is just showing the 52-week change just to sort of work out some day of week effects, but think of this as year-over-year changes and balances for restaurants only, right? So there's a chart that's all that I'm not showing here, and it has more or less the same shape. But in restaurants, you can see this really poignantly. In restaurants were an industry of concern just because they were, so focal in terms of the impact early days. You do see after PPP applications resumed on April 27th, a really sharp jump up at the median, right? So this isn't averages. And this is suggesting that, like, which I think we now see in many other data sources, Chase lens notwithstanding, like a real movement for the typical small business that is hard to attribute to anything, at least in the restaurant sector, that then sort of widespread adoption and sort of like flowing through of PPP funds. Of course, the overall span here is quite wide in terms of the time these funds are arriving, but a lot of small businesses really moved right around the beginning of May, end of April. And so that certainly showed up in our data. Yes, you do see differential movement for Black, Hispanic, and white-owned restaurants. Some of that I think is about the size of these establishments. The more employees you have, the differential response because PP is really targeting and scaled at employee sizes, you might see something a little bit different that has something to do with that, although I don't know if it's entirely explaining that difference. A kind of interesting thing that we also saw was looking at an industry that is less labor intensive, personal services. A lot of those are going to have fewer employees. A lot of those are also going to just be a lot smaller. So, if you squint at this and you look just to the right of the second dotted line, you do see a still quite sharp movement across races and balances right after April 27th that is similar in shape to what we saw in restaurants. So I think there's some movement here from PPP as well. But there's a lot of movement also in the middle of April, particularly among Black-owned personal services businesses. These are some of the smallest businesses in terms of revenue balances, like however you want to measure it in our sample, and I think in the universe of the small business sector. What we think is happening here is basically leakage from programs that are targeted at households. We're in the small business sector. There is a lot of overlap between sort of household finance and small business finance. And so if you are a personal service owner and your business is relatively small, you maybe have a spouse or another household member who's in the labor force and you're getting something, through that channel. A lot of that appears to be getting moved over to some of the smaller small businesses, which again, we thought was important for policymakers to understand that there is some overlap between the scope of these policy interventions. I think the last piece, and this is more sort of like leaning into some stuff that we're working on, that we are done working on, we'll be releasing soon. But just to give you a little bit of a preview based on sort of both what we started to see in our data and public data sources. This question about sort of the responsivity of small business expenses to a revenue shock, I think is really important. Because it's one of the ways that the sector is kind of keeping the rest of the economy afloat, right? It's like employment is an important piece of this. And I think a lot of what's happening here, like when we see these pullbacks in expenses, some of those are employee expenses, but some of that is rent. Some of those are other supplier expenses. And so if you're upstream of a small business, which a substantial piece of the economy is, you might be worried about a situation in which, sort of at the top of the funnel, we're pushing in lots of stimulus or other programs through the small business sector with the intent to sort of push it out, to see expenses stay down for a long time, particularly below revenue growth. And so, you can sort of see that in restaurants here through the end of May. This is pivoting to Census Bureau data just to give a lens on sort of why you might find this to be an interesting question. Small business cash balances, well, let me jump back a couple of slides. You see that they're going up 20, 40, 60% for personal services firms. I don't know if you're paying attention here to the scale of this. You see them going up 20, 40, 60, 80, 100% for restaurants. Small business balances, certainly in the Chase data through the end of May, were like pretty high. Like I was surprised by how high they were. I wouldn't have anticipated them being that high, with the sort of an echo of what we saw in households, right? Like there was a policy intervention. The intention was to push liquidity in, with the hope that it would be spent. Reasonable to think that, you know, especially if it's coming in a time focused way, like a little bit front loaded, that there would be some savings behavior. Certainly seemed like we were seeing this on small businesses as well. When you look at the census data, and here the time scale is much expanded, right? So this is going from end of April to, you know, late June with a break, and then August to October, right? So now, like, not quite up through today, but fairly recent data. The typical small business has a lot more cash than it did before. This measure is actually quite similar to the cash buffer days measure that we talked about before. They sort of like talk about how they measure it slightly differently than we do, and they're doing it with a survey rather than asking people to do the computation. So there's a lot of movement you could sort of see there, but you're still getting, you know, a majority of small businesses saying that they have over a month of what they would call business operations, which is, we know even from this chart, like higher than it was in April. And, you know, from our data, you know, I would tell you that this is quite a bit higher than what I would expect this response to be, you know, in 2019 or any year before that. So even through, you know, mid-October, small business cash balances are, I think, are sort of what I would say are surprisingly high, given anyway, the kinds of things that are in the policy discussion right now, depending on who you ask. And not for nothing, again, this is on external data. This isn't on Chase data. The employment view, I'm showing you data from ADP. I did a sort of a look at this from Paychex, which is another payroll processor that has a little bit more focus on small businesses. You know, the growth in the implied growth in employment by firm size is what I'm charting here, and, you know, sort of showing you for a range of smallish businesses, you know, less than 50, less than 20. It doesn't matter that much. It's not clear that it's recovered, at least by September. You sort of see it ticking up. So balances are up. There was a policy innovation to push money through to support employment. Kind of hard to do employment when people aren't coming in, revenues remain down. So, you know, it's a little bit of a complicated situation, which I'm really empathetic for small business owners, but a little bit surprising, I think, to some, to see that that payroll numbers measured either in dollars or employees are still, you know, materially below where they were a year ago. And so again, I think it's just something to think about, and certainly something we're trying to draw attention to as we try to walk through, like, well, how should we think about whatever the next round of policy is in terms of pushing more liquidity into different parts of the economy. One last thing I just wanted to just flag, it's not, I mean, it's part of our journey through understanding what's happening in COVID, but it has a little bit of a different shape. We have another team that really focuses on card spending, a subset of card spending that we would call local commerce. We think it's like especially important to local economies because it's in products that are, let's call it, substitutable against things you might provide in a neighborhood, or more locally than not. So think, you know, you might live in a neighborhood where you could go to a clothing store, buy groceries, get gas, go to a pharmacy, go to a restaurant, something like that. But you probably aren't locally hiring for your plane tickets. And you're probably, you know, like hotels are a little bit complicated because it's mostly not local. Like, there's some things that we're excluding here. We have a separate set of analyses that look quite like the consumer analyses on sort of like what's happening through this lens about sort of what happened. That's mostly what I'm showing here. The chart isn't so important, other than you can see here the point that I made before about less sensitivity to city than you might think in terms of like what the overall shape of this look like, particularly through April. I mean, you see sort of more or less recovery in cities here, but not so much the point. Some interesting things, though, I think are about, I would think about them as institutional. more in the sociology, if I might say, sense of institutions in terms of like patterns of behavior as opposed to sort of like economic institutions. But um, I think there's some really interesting possible movement in terms of the way people engage with the economy. And so what I'm showing here is, this lens gives us a particularly good view on online versus offline spending. Um, Online spending is carrying, at least through July, like all of the spending growth, right? Like everything offline is still down a lot. And while we do see some recovery there too, it's not down as much. All of the positive movement is coming from online spending, which I think starts to raise questions about how particularly local producers may or may not be faring as we sort of look to a differently shaped recovery in 2021, perhaps. You can dig in a lot with card data as well. I mean, so more here kind of highlighting in case people have questions, like the sorts of things you can do, which is like, wait, well, like where are people coming from? Like, are they changing their patterns of like geographic consumption? So being the bank, we can see both like where the person lives, or at least where we send their card statement, and like where they're shopping. We saw some interesting patterns. Here it's focusing on grocery because it's a place where we have a particularly sharp lens and it was moving around a lot, as many of you may have experienced. Um, like wanted to understand, well, can we start to peer into, again, ways in which we think the economy might be moving in a more permanent way or a potentially more permanent way because people are learning new patterns of behavior, because they have had to change their spending practices in a way that wasn't showing up in aggregate national statistics. And that's part of what you see here. Kind of take away, we were, for instance, seeing that in high income neighborhoods, there was a lot more ability to sort of shop locally for groceries than there was in lower income neighborhoods. You see here the light green bars are kind of the pattern across income quintiles at the neighborhood level in terms of how far were people going to grocery stores. So in February, kind of across the board, it was 2 miles or so, 2.7 miles, something like that, with some. This is the interquartile range that's being shown. So you sort of see the top and the bottom of the green bars are that range, but you see some variation across income quintiles, but it's like not as interesting as the variation you see in the dark green bars, where there's like meaningful numbers of people who are now moving in high income neighborhoods to something that's quite close. That's those dark green bars coming down quite close to the zero lines, in a way that's not true for lower income neighborhoods. Like there isn't such a big change. And so again, like what does that mean? What are the distributional implications of this like macro policy and macro phenomenon? I think is part of what we're trying to understand. So I think I'll wrap up there in terms of me sort of talking at you guys. Like these are really quite open questions that I'm putting out here, just in terms of, like, I mean, like one of the reasons I wanted to walk through instead of starting at the end and just sort of like summarizing what it is that we know today is, for us, we had to think through, like, are we informing sort of real-time decision making? Do we really understand what's happening well enough to tell somebody something that's going to help or really guide the real-time decision in exactly the right way? I don't think I'm saying anything particularly crazy to suggest that the targeting and under and overshoots can be a thing when you need to respond quickly. So I think that's all fine, but certainly something that we experienced a little bit real time, trying to get things out the door as quickly as we could to be responsive, but also understanding that the policy questions were being shaped as we saw what was happening. Now I think we're spending a lot of time thinking about, like, should we be leaning into that, or should we be leaning into understanding what just happened more, because we are in the middle of the second wave, it seems. Right. So this is kind of that there are new things that are happening, and like how should we weight research and policy attention to understanding what just happened versus what might be happening going forward. And then I think a little bit of the substantive question that you maybe heard me scratching at is, relative to what we had seen in the past, not so much directionally, but in level, I think the amount of kind of asset growth, particularly liquid asset growth, that we've seen has been a little surprising. And so should you interpret that as households and small businesses are quite resilient and can kind of manage with less, or like we're really doing like long-term damage to sort of assets by not investing in them. And here it's not just the hard assets, but also other kinds of things that we might be breaking. A question, it's totally a question and something I think we continue to think about. Anyway, so with that, I think I'll pause. I think I'm around my time, and we'll take any questions from anyone who wants to raise them.
Thank you, Chris, for the very informative presentation. We're now going into the Q&A part. I will start by asking a few questions. We already have a couple of questions from the audience. For people in the audience, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. We're going to unmute you, or you can type it in the Q&A box. We can still unmute you, or I can read out the questions. So I'll start by asking a couple. First, we are in an environment which is a demand slump, meaning people don't go out and buy stuff. Part of that is due to just the disruption of normal livelihood, social distancing and lockdown measures. It's hard to dine in restaurants. Part of that is also due to income shock because of, if I don't go out and buy stuff, other people get unemployed, and then, due to lack of income, they don't go out and buy stuff. I feel that in the JPMorgan Chase Institute, you have this rare combination of data that enables you to separate out the two in some sense. You can sort of trace out how people's spending changes, conditioning or unconditioning on unemployment. And that would be able to inform sort of the policy question of how much, for example, the PPP program exists to keep unemployment, and that only addressed part of this, the reason that demand declines due to income shocks, right, but it doesn't address the changing livelihood. So I feel, have you thought about how to use the data to separate out the two? What part is the direct hit of the COVID? What part of that is due to, the multiplier effect of some of the Keynesian forces? That's my first question.
So there's an answer to that question, and then there's like a better answer that I can frame, but that I don't think we've really done as much as I think we would like to. A kind of approach that we have taken, and this has again been more on the consumer side of the house, and so sort of, I hope I frame it correctly, but has been to try. I mean, we can isolate people who we see people's income. So long story short, right? We can tell certainly $1 to your account, like undifferentiated for sure. If it's certain kinds of labor payments, I think we see pretty well. So if you get the direct deposit, like we can see your, even though it's anonymized, still see that it looks like it was a payroll. If it's a federal payment, we see that pretty well as well. So like you might notice that there was a lot of focus on UI and other federal programs I didn't sort of call out as much. We can generally differentiate those. And so as a form answer to some of that question, when looking at the limited case of the household response, you can differentiate the spending response, for instance, of people who are getting UI from those who aren't. You can see who's getting like extra UI or not based on the levels sometimes, right? So you can do a little bit of the differentiation from the different inflow channels, or I guess what you would call it income channels, and parse it out a little bit better. So that's kind of my first answer, right? So like, and I think you saw it in some of the slides, right? Like people who had job separations and some of this I think is drawn out in much more color, right? So you can see among UI recipients that are getting UI at different times, you can see that spending response before they get UI, rather we can look backwards and be like, okay, we saw that you got UI in this, we saw you appear not to have a job. So if you went for a long time without getting UI, we see a greater spending response, and we can kind of characterize the different levels of response there. So you can get reasonably far with that, sort of box around the household, but more of the like, and then sort of how does it ripple through? I don't think we've done as much about that. I mean, I'm probably just reading back to you what you were just suggesting. Like, wouldn't it be cool if you could do that? It would really be cool, and it's something we've been thinking about for a while. If you stand far enough back from our data, it's like, but don't you see the dollar like when it flows all the way through the network is how I think about it. And it's like, well, kind of, if we like imagine all businesses were small businesses and they all bank with Chase. So I'm not suggesting that that's not a policy recommendation. Even then, it's not obvious from our data if Ernest, like if you are a small business owner and I am your employee, I can't always directly see that you're paying me, in part because it gets animated by a payroll processor typically, right? So like if you wrote me a check directly, then maybe I could see it. So like our lens is just short of being able to tie it all the way together. And so what we end up doing is kind of doing pieces of it, missing big pieces. Like we don't have a great, let me put that a different way. We haven't built an infrastructure that would allow us to, in a customer respectful way, analyze finances of larger businesses that make up a huge part of the economy as well. And so like we kind of have a little bit of a blind spot there, implicit in the structure of the talk. So like, yes, I would love to do that. We are continuing to push at that. And the way that we've gotten at that has been this little piecemeal, approach, admittedly, of, well, here's a piece of the sector that we see really well. Here's another piece that we see really well. And, put hands up and try to attach as best as we can.
Yeah, that would be super interesting. Okay, I'm going to delay my other questions because we have a couple from the audience. And I will let them ask if they're around. Jeffrey Schaefer?
Yes, this is very fascinating insight you're getting out of your data. And I had two questions to help me understand it a little better. One, do you compare what you're seeing in your database from what other institutions are seeing that would partly be the result of the structure of your customers versus theirs? And second, when you show the expenses for small businesses, are those all expenses, including rent payments and mortgages and real estate taxes?
Yep. That's both great questions. Maybe I'll start with the second one first and then back into the first one. When we look at, on the small business side, when we look at expenses, the same thing will be true revenues as well. What we're doing is we look at all of the outflows and we try to identify the ones that we think are non-operational, that are basically financial payments. That has gotten a little bit easier to do over time because so many of those payments are electronic, that you can, like if it's a payment to another bank or if it's a payment to Chase, like it's pretty clear from the identifiers that we have in the transaction data that it's that. And so we can take those out and sort of, we are treating everything that is left as an expense. For people like me who worry about cash flow accounting, we are not parsing sort of investment cash flows from operating, and like in the small business sector, I get like a little less worked up about that than I might if we got into sort of larger businesses. So yes, it would include rent payments. Yes, it would include mortgage payments. It would include payroll. It would include anything. The only one of those that I think we see particularly well that's relevant to the conversation is payroll. So a question that we had a lot of conversations with about, particularly sort of around DC, was like, well, do you see rent? And it's been a pain point that we don't see it. We can't cleanly identify rent payments, right? We can tell you this is total expenses. We can tell you this is payroll. We could tell you health insurance payments to the extent that anybody wanted to know about that, which we really tried to sell. It was a little bit hard a few years ago. But like those are the ones that we are more confident right now that we can see.
But that would suggest that payroll payments would be a lot more volatile than the total expenses that you're showing. Is that right?
Yes. First of all, in general, small business payroll payments are super volatile, right? In a way that I think people don't pay much attention to as they might. And then, one of the reasons why I showed here, I'll bring it back up just in case it's helpful for context. And this is also, kind of getting at your other question about sort of how does our data compare to other data. Like, yeah, it literally keeps me up at night, particularly when we're trying to get something out quickly. Whether the things that we're seeing are aligned to what you might see if you weren't just looking at small businesses that happen to hold a deposit account with Chase. This is a view. What I'm showing now is a view anyway on from outside the bank on payroll expenses, and it's honestly not that much more volatile than overall expenses. It is roughly shaped the same. if you try to do this in dollars from the paychecks data, it's roughly the same. It's not clear to me, and we might get a chance to come back and take another crack at this, that there's a really hard push either to preserve payroll or not. It feels a little bit more like they're cutting all their expenses to the extent that they can. And yes, I mean, so anyway, so like that's an early view. I don't know that we have super cleanly split out like how much of the expense decline is payroll or not. In part because the channels have moved a little bit, and so we want to make sure that our estimation is clean before we sort of tell somebody that. But I do feel comfortable saying that, you know, this you see payroll expenses going down here, call it 15% or so in April, and trying to go back to, I don't know, do we not have one? Sorry, I don't happen to have the chart with me right now, but the overall expenses in April go down more, at least in this view. So, and remember that most of these businesses are quite small. With respect to your question about sort of like how does it compare to other data sources? I think we try really hard to benchmark as best as we can. There aren't that many sources of data on small business finances, but in the kind of benchmarking that we have done, I think the shorthand is always, you should think about the typical Chase business banking client as being reasonably representative of a small business with like 1 to 7 employees. And there we tend to, across benchmarking exercises, be it trying to use the old survey of small business finances that hasn't been published in 20 years, to census data from the longitudinal business survey, things like that. We tend to benchmark out reasonably well there. We're a little bit more urban. I think it's probably the one place where you probably would see a little bit less.
Great. Next question is from Pamela Shainman. Pamela, please unmute yourself if you're around.
Hi, my question goes to a policy decision. So it's the inverse of really what you've suggested. And it goes to the designation of businesses as essential services and the extent to which that actually boxes out small businesses, particularly in the time frame you're looking at, because the big box stores could sell across their inventory, whereas something much more specialized could, because they didn't have groceries or medicines, couldn't sell their products.
That is probably right. I mean, I'm wandering into the anecdotal, but I know some small business owners. I used to go to their stores, and I definitely heard versions of this, right, where there was a lot of frustration. I'm thinking in particular of they were a cupcake. They specialized in cupcakes, right? And it turns out cupcakes aren't essential in Maryland, right? Like, but if they've been a grocery store, right? So that product specialization, definitely, I saw it in practice, but in some sense, you know, that is on a list of things where I think scale had its advantages in a variety of ways, right? Like here we're talking sort of like breadth of product, and I think like you for in a number of ways, including but not limited to this, being a bigger business would have given you more opportunity to sort of take advantage of exceptions, as it were. If you needed to make technology investments to service customers online, I watched small and larger businesses do the same thing, and I saw how the smaller businesses didn't have the assets, I think, to do it as well. So I think it's quite a long list of these things on which I would put this, and I totally agree with your inference here. We didn't try to measure it, and it's not totally clear to us, to me, how we might do so with our data lens, but that absolutely sounds right to me.
The next question comes from Oliver Jessic. Oliver, if you're around, unmute yourself.
Hi Hi, Chris. Hi, Ernest. A very interesting presentation. So my question is regarding sort of a proxy for social distancing and the spending behavior. I mean, first of all, I think you are able to distinguish online shopping versus physical shopping, right? So my question, I assume, is more targeted to the physical shopping. And so here, I wonder whether you have sort of tried to connect some of the quote unquote social distancing data. That means like, take like companies like SafeGraph or that made their data available to like physical spending behavior. Did you find any association, and if so, what?
No, it's a really good question. And again, there'll be like a couple of shapes of answers here. Without really granular data, I think is going to be sort of the first answer. We didn't find much of an effect. But then again, we didn't use really granular data. So like getting a no effect with not particularly good data shouldn't draw too much conclusion from that, right? But we were surprised that it was like hard to find that kind of effect where we thought we might see more macro cities that put in sort of more social distancing measures, having a different spending pattern, and we didn't really see that. We have some researchers who've been working with us who were looking at a different question, and so I don't want to sort of get ahead of the research, but I can say that like when they looked a little bit more carefully, sort of at a county level against a particular spending response, they did start to see that. So like if you sharpen the tool enough, you'll get a significant effect, sort of long story short. So you should, so this answer has a little bit of like, yes, it is important. Was it big enough to make sort of big macro differences that we could easily see? Apparently not, but like it would be a little surprising that it didn't make any difference, right? And so I think you have to measure carefully to see it.
But I suppose you could also just look at the sort of substitution between physical and online, right? Which is sort of a corollary.
And that is where I think, again, we're trying to find the right question to ask and the right way to resource it. But why you saw, a couple of slides I threw in there at the end around, okay, let's narrow down to food consumption specifically, which has like a particular shape and a lot more clarity, at least in the card data, about like online versus offline, and like we can actually measure like how far the grocery store is from your house versus like there I think we can do a little bit more on a much more narrow question. And I think it is where, at least even in our early data, you could see some things that sort of suggested that space anyway. And sort of like whether you had to go a long way. We're like live doing like another project trying to understand like differential changes in responsivity to distance, sort of before and after, kind of modeling a little bit more carefully, and early results suggest that, there's probably, if you look at it carefully enough, you definitely will.
I see. Just a very short follow-up. Do you see any sort of hoarding behavior as well in your data? I mean, there was obviously the narratives, right, of empty grocery shelves and so on. Not just because not because people are eating more, but because people are just substituting their spending behavior, right?
We didn't really look for it, to be completely honest with you. Can you see it anywhere? In a different chart that's not in this deck, you'd see like a grocery bump, but like that's not just hoarding, right? And again, here the data lens, we don't have scanner data, right? So we can't see like product. What we can see is, you shop at Safeway.
Exactly.
So it's a little bit hard from our lens, or you shopped at Amazon for that matter. And so
I mean, the interesting thing is because you can sort of explore the income gradient because you observe income as well as spending, right? That's kind of nice. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
So to follow up on Oliver's last question about hoarding behavior, I guess you can also try to detect hoarding maybe using the historical natural disaster cases, like a few days before the hurricane. Compare, if you don't observe, if the data doesn't have resolution to detect hoarding there, then it probably wouldn't be able to for COVID. But if you do detect hoarding there, you can at least put a bound on the hoarding behavior during COVID.
Right. I mean, what we do see for sure in like the other context, and I probably didn't show it, but is like pre-buying, which is a little bit, or I don't call it that, is a little bit of a different phenomenon than hoarding, right? So like we definitely see like people going to Home Depot before, you know, hurricane hits. But I don't know if it's hoarding as much as it's like getting ahead of like a disruption. So maybe that's mincing concepts.
I have a couple of other related questions. One is relating to the result you showed towards the end, but not the very end, about, you know, small businesses have better cash position and more cash balances. So we know many small business, you know, had to exit: restaurant, coffee shop, you know, cupcake store, and so they had to close down. The firms that survive tend to be in better financial situations. So I wonder how much of the reported increase in the liquidity is due to selection of surviving firm, or are you part controlling for that?
We're trying to best, I mean, in an internal analysis that I didn't show you, right? I can say what about that? You could, for instance, like identify a cohort of businesses, compare them, you know, to sort of like track what they're doing, or some setup that looks like that doesn't like allow them to exit from the cohort. Then you have to sort of think about like, well, how, like, what is it that I want to evaluate in terms of cash position for businesses that either did exit or might have exited, because even there, our lens on exit, I think, is as good as anybody's, like at a yearly resolution. Like, did you close your bank account? It's a little complicated to interpret that, like in May 2020 or even maybe August 2020. It's a little hard to say. But so putting that question aside, I don't know, I don't care, but I know like the last balances that I saw, you could sort of look at the last balance you saw. Doing that kind of thing, I would say, I think I'm okay to say today anyway, 2 days ahead of releasing such a thing, it does not make the shape of the answer look very different. I thought it was going to be like a lot, and it just didn't move. Like they're just, exits are lower than I might have thought, and balances are higher than I might have thought.
I see. So we are almost at almost time. I'm going to ask one last question. So, you know, this pandemic is a situation where timely dissemination of information on consumer behavior, on small business, on their financial health is very useful for policy. I wonder what feature or what are the channels for which, you know, through which JPMorgan Chase Institute, given the data you have, given the amount of research you're producing, what are the channels to which you can very timely inform policy, or what are the channels you can connect or disseminate the information to policymakers, or any comments on
it? It is a great question, and it is a hard question. You know, look, I mean, the first, second, third, and fourth answer probably is, you know, look, what we mostly do is analyze data, produce reports, put them on a public website, and share them. And like, there's like a reason that like that's call it our supermodal response, right? And so that's basically the answer. Is we can try to be as fast as we can at getting things sort of turned around and out there. I think, you know, anything outside of that, like, there's an opportunity space around sort of like, well, how, like, what are the other ways that you might work with policymakers to help them understand what you're seeing, like, as you're working on getting it out. But that is a complicated space, just because financial services industry is regulated, right? And like, you have to be very careful about sort of like the way you do that. But at the same time, like, we want to be easy for me to say on behalf of the institute. I can speak on behalf of the institute, but I think I can say on behalf of the firm that like the firm wants to create the institute in response to the last, you know, crisis, basically, where it was like, it is a travesty that a bank might have known something that a policymaker didn't know, in terms of the data that we had internal. And so I think we continue to sort of push at that interface to find ways, mostly to get the sort of transaction to publication timeline as short as possible, but are trying to explore other ways to do that, to get that even closer when we can.
All right. Thank you, Chris. We are at the time. Thanks very much for this fascinating webinar. I will give you, or the audience will give you, a virtual round of applause.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining us today.